It was late afternoon, the kind of quiet time when the sun sits low and the sky glows with soft orange light. The roads were calm, only a few cars passing now and then. A young woman was driving home after a long day at work. The week had been tiring, but she liked this time of day, the slow moments between daylight and evening when everything seemed to settle down. She rolled her window halfway down to let the breeze in. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky looked clear. Her favorite song was playing on the radio, and she tapped her fingers lightly on the steering wheel. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful, and predictable. But sometimes life doesn't give a warning before it changes everything. As she drove around a bend, she noticed a strange flicker ahead. It took her a second to realize it wasn't the sun reflecting off glass. It was fire. Smoke curled up from behind the line of trees along the road. Her heart skipped a beat. She slowed her car, squinting ahead, and saw a vehicle crash near a ditch, flames already rising from under its hood. Without thinking twice, she pulled over, parked, and jumped out. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and fuel, the sound of crackling fire mixed with faint cries coming from the car. She ran closer, her pulse pounding so loud it drowned out every other thought. There was no one else around, no sirens, no crowd, just her and the burning car. Through the window, she saw a small figure strapped in the back seat, a child, maybe 2, maybe 3 years old. He was crying, kicking weakly against the car seat. The heat hit her face like an open oven, but she didn't stop. She tried the door handle, locked. She banged on the glass, shouting for help, though there was no one to hear. The child's cries grew sharper, frightened. Her hands shook, but she pulled the edge of her sleeve over her fingers and tried to tug at the back door handle again. It didn't budge. She looked around, spotted a rock near the roadside, and grabbed it. With all the strength she had, she struck the window once, twice, until it shattered into a cloud of glass. The noise made the child flinch, but she spoke softly through the smoke, telling him it was okay, that she was there to help. The fire was spreading faster now. Flames licked at the seats near the front, black smoke filling the space. Her eyes stung as she leaned in through the broken window. The seatbelt buckle was jammed. Her fingers felt clumsy and slick with sweat as she struggled with it. Time seemed to move in slow motion, yet every second felt like forever. Finally, the buckle clicked open. She pulled the child toward her, holding him tight against her chest. His tiny arms clung to her neck, trembling. With one quick motion, she backed out of the window, glass scraping her arm, but she didn't care. She just needed to get him away from that car. She ran a few steps back before hearing a loud crack behind her. A burst of flame shot out from the hood, and the car was engulfed in thick black smoke. She stumbled onto the grass and fell to her knees, still clutching the child. He was coughing and crying softly. She brushed soot from his cheeks and checked him over. No visible wounds, just fear in his wide eyes. She whispered to him, trying to calm him down. Her voice trembled, but she kept it gentle. "You're safe now." "It's okay. You're safe." Minutes later, another car came down the road and stopped suddenly when the driver saw the smoke. A man ran toward them, shouting to see if anyone was hurt. She nodded, still catching her breath, and told him to call emergency services. He pulled out his phone, and within minutes the distant wail of sirens began to grow louder. By the time the fire truck and ambulance arrived, she was sitting on the curb with the toddler in her lap, rocking him gently. Her clothes were dusty, her hair smelled of smoke, and her hands were trembling. But she didn't seem to notice. The firefighters rushed to control the blaze while the paramedics checked the child. They said he was lucky. No serious injuries, just mild smoke inhalation. The woman let out a shaky sigh of relief. One of the paramedics asked her a few questions, but she didn't have many answers. She didn't know who the child belonged to or how the crash happened. She just happened to be there at the right moment. When they were done, she stood quietly watching as the firefighters worked. The child was being placed in the ambulance, and for a moment he looked back at her. His eyes still wet but calm now. She smiled at him and gave a small wave. As the ambulance doors closed, she suddenly felt the weight of what had just happened. Her heart was still racing. The sound of the explosion replayed in her head again and again. She looked down at her, soot-stained hands, and finally realized how close everything had been. If she had driven by a minute later, that child might not have survived. The thought made her knees weak. She thanked the paramedics and walked back to her car. Her legs felt heavy, her throat dry. She sat inside for a few minutes before turning the key. For a long time, she just stared through the windshield, lost in thought. The world outside looked the same, the trees, the road, the fading sunset. But something inside her felt different. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she knew she'd never forget what had just happened. When she finally drove away, she didn't look back. She told no one what she'd done that night. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because it felt too big, too raw to explain. She went home, took a long shower to wash away the smell of smoke, and tried to sleep. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little boy's face, his tears, and the way he had clung to her so tightly. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from friends, co-workers, and even people she hadn't spoken to in years filled her notifications. Everyone was sharing a local news clip about a woman who had saved a toddler from a burning car. The video was grainy. Someone had recorded from a distance after she'd already pulled the boy out, but her figure was still visible. Her heart skipped. She hadn't realized anyone saw her. The news anchor called her a hero. Social media was full of posts praising her bravery, calling her the mystery woman. People were asking who she was. She felt overwhelmed and a little embarrassed. She never wanted attention. She hadn't done it to be noticed. She just couldn't have driven away knowing a child was trapped in that fire. At work that day, her co-workers were buzzing with excitement. They showed her the video, completely unaware that the woman in it was standing right beside them. She smiled awkwardly, saying things like, "Wow, that's incredible," and she was really brave. Inside, she was torn between pride and discomfort. She wanted to stay anonymous, to let the story fade quietly, but fate rarely lets things stay quiet. By the evening, the story had spread beyond local news. National outlets were picking it up. Headlines talked about a billionaire's son being rescued by an unnamed woman. That was the first time she realized the child she saved belonged to someone powerful. The thought startled her. She hadn't recognized the car or thought about who it belonged to in the moment. It hadn't mattered. A life was a life. Later that night, she sat by the window of her small apartment, looking out at the city lights. The noise of the day had finally quieted down. She felt strange knowing millions of people were talking about something she'd done. Part of her wanted to tell them to stop making it sound like a movie. It hadn't felt heroic. It had felt terrifying. But she was also grateful the boy was safe. That was all that really mattered. Somewhere else in the city, a man was watching the same news report. He was powerful, known for his influence, wealth, and reserved nature. But that night, none of that mattered. He watched the grainy footage over and over again, his heart pounding each time he saw the shadowy figure pulling his son from the flames. He wanted to find her, to thank her, to look into the eyes of the person who had saved the most precious thing in his life. She, however, had no idea that her quiet life was about to change again. For her, the day had been about courage and fear and instinct. For him, it had been about loss narrowly avoided. And for both of them, it was only the beginning of something neither could have expected. The night ended in silence, but the story was already moving beyond her control. The news kept spreading. People kept searching. And while she sat alone in her small apartment, sipping tea and trying to calm her thoughts, she didn't know that. By the next morning, there would be a knock on her door that would change everything all over again. The next morning started quietly, but the world around her was far from calm. While she went about her usual routine, making coffee and getting ready for work, the news had already spread everywhere. Her phone kept lighting up with new messages, and every news channel seemed to be talking about the same thing: the mystery woman who saved a child from a burning car. She tried not to think about it, but it was impossible to ignore. Even as she walked to the bus stop, people around her were talking about it. She heard one man say, "Can you imagine the courage it takes to do that?" Another replied, "Whoever she is, she deserves a medal." She lowered her head and kept walking. She never wanted to be a hero. She just wanted things to go back to normal. But fate had already decided that her life wouldn't be the same again. That morning, In a large glass office miles away, a man was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a news screen. His suit jacket was on the chair behind him, his tie half undone. He had been awake most of the night, replaying the nightmare in his head. The phone call, the panic, the rush to the hospital. His little boy was safe now, sleeping peacefully under medical care. But every time he thought of what could have happened, his chest tightened. He owed everything to a woman he didn't even know. The footage he had seen on the news wasn't clear, but it showed enough. A small figure running into the smoke, pulling a child out, holding him close while the car burned behind her. No one knew who she was yet, and that made him restless. He wasn't the kind of man used to not knowing. His entire life was built on control, power, and precision. But this time, control had been taken away from him, and his son's life had been placed in the hands of a stranger. He made a few phone calls, asking for help to find her. His assistant, his security team, even local police officers were searching for any clue about her identity. He wasn't looking to make a show out of it. He didn't care about cameras or publicity. He just needed to see her, face to face, to thank her for saving his child. Back in her small apartment, she was trying to keep her life as normal as possible. She avoided watching the news and ignored most of her messages. But by afternoon, a coworker knocked gently on her desk at work and said, "I think they're talking about you." She forced a small laugh and said, "I think you've got the wrong person." Her coworker smiled knowingly. "Come on, we all saw the video. You were wearing the same jacket yesterday." Her heart skipped. She hadn't realized it was that obvious. Soon others in the office began to ask questions too. Some praised her, some were just curious, but all eyes seemed to be on her. She smiled politely, thanked them for their kind words, but deep down she wanted to disappear. She didn't want interviews, attention, or fame. Later that evening, as she walked home, she noticed a few reporters outside the building next to hers. They were talking to neighbors, showing photos, asking questions. Her pulse quickened. She turned the corner quietly and took the back stairwell to her apartment. She closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. She didn't understand how people even knew where to look. That night, she made a simple dinner but barely touched it. She kept thinking about the child. She had seen his face only for a few minutes, but it was a face she couldn't forget. Round cheeks, soft curls, big brown eyes filled with fear. She hoped he was okay. She hoped he didn't have nightmares about the fire. On the other side of the city, the man who owned half the businesses downtown sat in a hospital chair beside his son's bed. The little boy was awake now, clutching a small stuffed bear. When he saw his father, he smiled sleepily and said, "Lady saved me." The man swallowed hard, trying not to show the tears that suddenly threatened to rise. "Yes," he whispered. "She did." That night he made up his mind. He would find her himself if he had to. He had people searching, yes, but something told him that this meeting wasn't about business or formality. It was personal, deeply personal. By the next morning, her photo was circulating online. Someone from her workplace had posted a blurry picture, confirming her name and where she worked. It spread faster than she could have imagined. Reporters started calling. Her social media was flooded with messages, some thanking her, others offering interviews or sponsorships. She didn't respond to any of them. She stayed home that day, avoiding the outside world. She turned off her phone and sat by the window, sipping tea and watching the street below. It was quiet, but she had a strange feeling in her chest, like something was about to happen. That afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the buildings, she heard a knock at her door. It was soft at first, then a little firmer. She froze. For a moment she thought it might be another reporter, but something about the sound made her curious. She hesitated, then walked slowly to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a dark suit, holding a small bouquet of flowers. He wasn't alone. Another man stood behind him, likely a driver or assistant. Her first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home. But then she saw his face. It was familiar. Not from real life, but from television and magazines. She had seen his photo in news articles about business awards and charity events. It was him, the powerful man whose son she had saved. Her breath caught in her throat. After a few seconds, she slowly opened the door. He looked at her with eyes that were tired but kind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said softly, "You're the one who saved my son." She nodded, unsure what to say. He handed her the flowers and took a small step closer, his voice low and sincere. I don't even know how to begin to thank you. I've imagined every possible way this could have gone, and every one of them ends with me losing him. Except the one where you appeared. She looked down, her cheeks warming. You don't have to thank me. I just happened to be there. He shook his head gently. No, you didn't just happen to be there. You ran into a fire. You saved a child you didn't even know. Most people wouldn't have done that. There was a quiet pause between them. He looked at her with genuine gratitude, and she could see the exhaustion in his face, not just from lack of sleep, but from the emotional storm he'd been through. I don't want to make this a public thing, he continued. I just wanted to see you, to tell you in person how much it means to me. You gave me back my son. I can never repay that, but I'll always be grateful. She smiled softly. I'm glad he's okay. That's all that matters. For a long moment, they just stood there, the air between them calm and full of unspoken emotion. She didn't know how someone so powerful could look so human, so humble. It was strange. The man everyone saw as distant and commanding was now just a father, standing at her door with tears in his eyes. Before leaving, he asked quietly, would it be all right if I kept in touch? Not for publicity, just to thank you properly one day. She hesitated, then nodded. That's fine. He gave a small smile, one that carried both relief and sincerity. Then he turned to go, leaving her standing in the doorway, holding the flowers and wondering if any of this was real. After he left, she placed the flowers in a glass of water and sat down. The apartment felt unusually still. She thought about the look in his eyes, the mixture of gratitude, pain, and something else she couldn't quite name. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, just deeply human. That night, she couldn't sleep again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face at her door, the way he had spoken, the way he had thanked her. There was something about it that stayed with her. Somewhere across town, he sat alone in his large house, watching his son sleep peacefully. He kept thinking about the woman who had appeared out of nowhere and changed his entire world. In his life, he had met countless people, business partners, investors, politicians. But no one had ever made him feel what she did in that brief moment at her door. Humble, thankful, and small in the best possible way. Neither of them knew it yet, but that one meeting was only the beginning. The next few days passed quietly, though something had changed. Her life, which once moved in the same steady rhythm, now carried a strange new awareness. She couldn't stop thinking about the man's visit. The way he had stood there, so composed yet so raw with emotion, stayed in her mind. She had met many people in her life, but few had ever looked at her like that, not out of admiration, but with a kind of deep gratitude that seemed to come from the soul. She went back to work, hoping things would settle down. But every time she opened her phone or turned on the TV, there was still talk about the rescue. People were calling it the miracle on the highway. Some even speculated about who she might be. A few reporters had found her name, but the attention had started to fade, as it always does. She was relieved. One evening, she came home to find an envelope slid under her door. Inside was a small note written in neat handwriting. It said simply, "Thank you again for allowing me to visit. I would like to invite you to lunch. No cameras, no press, just conversation. From the grateful father." For a few minutes, she just stood there, staring at the paper. Her heart raced a little, though she wasn't sure why. She read the note again and again, trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to ignore it. She didn't belong in his world, and she didn't want to become part of something she couldn't understand. But another part of her was curious. Maybe it would be nice to see how the little boy was doing. After thinking for a while, she wrote a short reply on the back of the note. Lunch is fine, but please keep it simple. She slipped it into an envelope and left it with the doorman, as the address had been written there. The next day, she received a text from an unknown number confirming the time and place. A small restaurant near the park. Quiet and elegant, but not overly formal. When she arrived, the man was already there, standing as she walked in. He greeted her warmly, and she noticed right away how different he seemed from the public image she had seen on screens. In person, he looked more relaxed, though his presence still carried the quiet strength of someone used to responsibility. They sat down, and for a moment the air between them felt almost awkward. Then he smiled, and the tension eased. I hope you don't mind meeting me like this, he said softly. I just wanted to talk. Not about what happened, but about life. She nodded. It's all right. I was curious too. He signaled the waiter and soon they were served. The restaurant was peaceful, with soft music playing in the background. For the first few minutes they spoke politely. About the weather, the city, the little things people say when they're still getting to know each other. But soon the conversation shifted to something deeper. He told her how the accident had changed him. How before that day his life had been a blur of meetings, travel, and business deals. How he had thought he had control over everything, until the moment he nearly lost his son. I built my life around success, he said quietly, but when I saw that car burning, none of it mattered. She listened, her eyes soft with understanding. Sometimes it takes something unexpected to remind us what really matters, she said. I guess that's how life teaches us. He smiled faintly. You speak like someone who's lived through a lot. She looked down at her hands. Maybe not a lot. Just enough to learn that peace doesn't come from what you own, but from what you can live without. Her words struck him deeply. For someone who had everything, he realized how little peace he actually felt. She, on the other hand, seemed content with so little. Her calmness felt like something rare, something he hadn't felt in years. As they talked, hours passed without either of them noticing. They shared stories, about work, about growing up, about simple things like favorite books and childhood dreams. She laughed a few times and he found himself laughing too, really laughing for the first time in months. When lunch ended, he insisted on walking her home. The evening air was cool, the streetlights just beginning to glow. They walked slowly, talking about nothing in particular, yet it all felt meaningful. When they reached her building, she turned to him and said, You didn't have to go through all this trouble just to thank me. He smiled. It wasn't trouble. I think meeting you was something I needed. Not just to say thank you, but to remember what it feels like to be human again. She didn't know how to reply to that. His words lingered in her mind long after he left. Over the next few weeks, he kept in touch, but never in an overbearing way. Sometimes he sent a short message asking how her day was. Sometimes he invited her to small gatherings or charity events, always giving her the choice to say no. And often she did say no, not because she didn't want to see him, but because she wanted to keep her world simple. Yet somehow, every time she did see him, she found herself looking forward to it. Their connection grew in quiet, steady ways. There was no rush, no expectation, just two very different people learning to understand each other. He found comfort in her simplicity. She found warmth in his sincerity. One evening, he invited her to a park where he often took his son to play. She hesitated but agreed. When she arrived, the little boy ran up to her with a wide smile. He remembered her. He didn't say much, just held out a small flower he had picked. She took it, touched beyond words. Watching them together, the man and his son, made her realize something. For all his power and wealth, he was still just a father trying to do his best. The world saw him as unreachable, but up close he was just as human as anyone else. They sat on a bench while the boy played nearby. He talks about you sometimes, the man said softly. He calls you the brave lady. He says you saved him from the big fire. She smiled gently. He's a sweet kid. I'm glad he's happy. He is, the man said. And you've been a big part of that. I want you to know if you ever need anything ever, I'll be there. Not because I owe you, but because you're part of our story now. She didn't know what to say. Gratitude shone in his eyes, but there was also something else. A quiet trust that words couldn't describe. After that day, they became genuine friends. They met sometimes for coffee or took walks when their schedules allowed. It wasn't about status or obligation anymore. It was about the simple comfort of two people who had crossed paths in an extraordinary way and decided not to let that moment end there. But not everyone understood it. As weeks passed, whispers began to spread. People in his circle started noticing the woman who appeared beside him in quiet moments, at the park, at a cafe, sometimes even at charity events. Some assumed it was something romantic. Others speculated out of envy. He ignored it all. For once in his life, he didn't care what anyone thought. One afternoon, she found herself waiting at a coffee shop when he arrived late, looking a little tired but smiling. I've had a long day, he admitted, sitting down. Too many meetings. Too many people pretending to care. She handed him his coffee and said, "Then maybe this can be the 1 hour today when no one expects anything from you." He laughed softly. "You have no idea how much that means." In that moment, the friendship between them deepened, not because of what had happened, but because they both understood something about loneliness, kindness, and the strange way life connects people who are meant to meet. As the sun began to set, he looked at her and said, "You know, before the accident, I used to think people only helped others because they wanted something in return. You changed that for me." She smiled quietly. "Sometimes kindness doesn't need a reason. It's just what the heart tells you to do." He nodded, taking in her words. She didn't realize it, but her presence was changing him, teaching him to slow down, to breathe, to see the world with softer eyes. When they said goodbye that evening, he thanked her once again, but this time it wasn't about the fire or the rescue. It was for her time, her calmness, and the quiet strength she carried. And as she walked home through the peaceful streets, she realized something too, that sometimes the people we save end up saving us in return, in ways we never expect. Weeks turned into months, and what began as gratitude slowly turned into something deeper, though neither of them spoke about it directly. Their lives were so different, yet they found comfort in each other's company. He had a world filled with constant movement, meetings, events, people who spoke to him because of his name and power. She, on the other hand, lived quietly, working simple hours, spending evenings reading or cooking alone. But whenever they met, it felt like both of them could finally breathe. They never planned their meetings. They just seemed to happen naturally. Sometimes he would call in the evening and say, "I have an hour free. Want to take a walk?" Sometimes she would text, "There's a little cafe near the park and the one with the old piano. You should try their coffee." And he always came. One evening, they sat on a park bench watching the city lights blink to life. His son was playing nearby, running through the grass with another child. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was still clear. It was one of those peaceful moments when the world feels distant. "And only the present matters, you know," he said quietly. "I used to think strength was about control, about keeping everything in order. But after that accident, I realized strength is sometimes about letting go." She turned to look at him. "Letting go of what?" He thought for a moment. "The need to be perfect. The fear of being vulnerable. The idea that having power means you can't feel pain." She smiled softly. "You're learning to be human again." He laughed gently. "Maybe you're right. And maybe you're the one teaching me that." She didn't reply, but the warmth in her eyes said enough. In his world, people often agreed with him because of who he was, but she wasn't afraid to tell him when he was wrong or when he was being too serious. Sometimes she even teased him, and strangely, he liked it. He liked that she saw him as a person, not a headline. At the same time, she found something in him that she hadn't realized she needed, a reminder that even powerful people carry loneliness. When he spoke about his childhood or his late wife, there was a softness in his voice, a hint of sadness that she could feel. He wasn't just the man everyone saw on screens. He was a father, a human being who had known loss, love, and the ache of being misunderstood. One weekend, he invited her to visit a small community center he was building outside the city. "It's for single parents and their children," he explained. "After the accident, I wanted to do something meaningful, something that gives people hope." When she arrived, construction workers were busy and the place was still half finished. He walked her through the rooms, pointing out where the play area would be, the reading corner, and the small garden he planned to plant for the kids. She listened, watching the way his face lit up as he talked. "You really care about this," she said softly. "I do," he replied, "but you're the reason I started it. You reminded me that kindness still exists in the world, and I want to pass that on." She felt her throat tighten. "You give me too much credit." "I just I'd what anyone would have done." He stopped walking and looked at her. "No," he said gently. "Not everyone would have done what you did. That's why it matters." For a moment, they just stood there, surrounded by the sound of hammers and laughter in the distance. It was a simple exchange, yet something unspoken hung between them. An understanding that their connection was no longer just about the past, but about the future too. Over the next few months, she visited often. She helped with ideas for the center, choosing colors for the walls, planning events, even reading to children once it opened. The joy in her face whenever she worked with the kids didn't go unnoticed. He would sometimes stand quietly at a distance, just watching her, wondering how someone so ordinary could bring such light into every room. But life has a way of testing even the calmest hearts. One day, a gossip magazine published photos of them together, walking through the park, laughing outside the community center, sharing coffee at a corner cafe. The headline read, "Powerful businessman and mystery woman, is there more to the story?" When she saw it, her stomach dropped. She didn't care much about what strangers thought of her, but she hated the attention. She didn't belong in that kind of spotlight. That evening, she called him. "They're writing stories about us," she said quietly. "People are going to misunderstand." He sighed on the other end of the line. "I know, I saw it too. I'll take care of it. You don't have to. I just don't want this to get messy. I didn't ask for any of this." "I know you didn't," he said softly. "But please don't worry. I'll make sure no one bothers you." True to his word, within days the news faded. He used his influence to stop further stories from spreading. But the whole thing left her shaken. She began to pull away a little, not because she didn't care, but because she feared becoming a burden on his already complicated life. For a few weeks, she avoided his calls. She told herself it was better this way, that he had his world and she had hers. But one evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, she heard a knock at her door. She hesitated before opening it. He stood there holding 2 cups of coffee and a tired smile. "You stopped answering my calls," he said gently, "so I thought I'd come to you instead." She stepped aside, letting him in. "You shouldn't have come. People always talk," he interrupted softly. "Let them. I just wanted to see how you're doing," she sighed. "I'm fine. I just didn't want to cause problems for you." He set the coffee down and looked at her earnestly. "You're not a problem. You're the reason I've been smiling these past months." Her eyes softened. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to," he replied. "I'm saying it because it's true." There was a long silence. She could feel the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke easily about emotions, yet every word came from the heart. Finally, she smiled faintly. "You really are stubborn," he chuckled. "I've been called worse." They sat down, sipping their coffee in comfortable silence. The tension melted away, replaced by the quiet ease they always found in each other's company. As the night grew deeper, he said, "You know, sometimes I think that accident wasn't just a tragedy avoided. Maybe it was fate, a strange way the universe brings people together." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe, but fate only gives us chances. It's what we do with them that matters." He nodded, admiring how grounded she always was. She never chased anything, not fame, not fortune, not recognition. Maybe that's why he found her so different from everyone else he knew. Before leaving, he handed her a small envelope. "This isn't a gift," he said. "It's an invitation." She opened it and found an embossed card, an event invitation. It was for a charity gala he was hosting for the new community center. "I want you to come," he said softly. "You were part of why this all happened. It wouldn't feel right without you there." She hesitated. "I don't know if I belong in a place like that." "You belong more than anyone," he said, his tone gentle but firm. After he left, she looked at the invitation again. It glittered faintly under the lamplight, elegant and simple. Part of her was nervous, but another part, the quiet, brave part, knew she couldn't hide from the world forever. The night of the event arrived, and she wore a modest dress, simple but graceful. When she walked into the grand hall, she felt out of place at first. The room sparkled with chandeliers, soft music played, and guests mingled in polished suits and gowns. But when he saw her walk in, he smiled in a way that made everything else fade. He introduced her to people kindly, without fanfare, treating her not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. His son, dressed in a little suit, ran to her and hugged her legs, whispering, "You came." She knelt and hugged him back, her heart full. Later that night, as speeches began, he stood on stage and looked around the room. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate the opening of a place that will bring hope to many families. But there's someone here who taught me what hope truly looks like. Someone who reminded me that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it's just an ordinary person doing something extraordinary." He turned his eyes toward her, and the crowd followed. She felt her heart race, her cheeks warm, but his words were soft and full of respect. "She saved my son's life. and without her I might have lost faith in the goodness of people. Tonight I want to thank her, not just for what she did, but for who she is." The audience clapped warmly, some even standing. She smiled shyly, touched beyond words. It wasn't about the attention. It was about the sincerity in his voice, the honesty in his gratitude. As the night went on, they found themselves standing together near the balcony, looking out at the city lights once more. "I told you I didn't belong here," she said quietly, half smiling. He shook his head gently. "You belong wherever there's goodness, and that's anywhere you choose to be." The music played softly behind them, and for a brief, beautiful moment, everything felt perfectly still. Two people from different worlds connected not by luck or status, but by kindness, courage, and the strange, gentle power of fate. The days after the charity event were quieter yet full of change. Something had shifted between them, something gentle but undeniable. It wasn't about grand gestures or spoken promises. It was about the comfort of presence, the quiet way their lives had begun to fit together. He started visiting her more often, though not always with reason. Sometimes he'd just drop by her small home with a bag of groceries, saying he wanted to cook something simple for once. Other times she'd find small notes left by her door, handwritten, thoughtful, never overdone. She kept them all in a box, not because of what they said, but because of how they made her feel, seen, appreciated, understood. One evening, as they sat together on her porch, his little boy played with a toy car on the steps. The air was calm, filled with the soft hum of distant traffic. The city lights shimmered in the distance like fireflies. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "About what?" "About how fast everything changes. A few months ago I didn't even know your name, and now I can't imagine my days without hearing your voice." Her heart skipped for a second. She smiled faintly, trying to lighten the moment. "You sound like someone who's been reading too much poetry lately." He chuckled. "Maybe I have. Or maybe you just bring it out of me." There was a long, comfortable silence between them, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The boy's laughter echoed softly, and for a moment everything felt right, simple and peaceful. But peace, she knew, didn't always last forever. Life had its way of testing people even when they least expected it. A few weeks later, he told her he had to travel abroad for business. It would be for a month or two, something important he couldn't postpone. She understood, though part of her wished he didn't have to go. Before he left, he stopped by her place with his son. "I'll call whenever I can," he promised. "And you know he's going to miss you more than anyone." The boy hugged her tightly, his little voice full of emotion. "You'll wait for us, right?" She smiled, kneeling beside him. "Of course I will. I'll even bake your favorite cookies when you come back. Promise?" "Promise." When they drove away that evening, she stood by her window watching the taillights disappear down the road. She didn't know why her chest felt heavy. Maybe because she had grown used to the sound of their laughter in her home, something that made her life feel warmer. Days passed, and though they spoke often on the phone, she missed their quiet evenings and his son's cheerful chatter. His calls were usually short, quick check-ins between meetings, but his voice always carried warmth. "I'll be back soon," he'd say. "Don't forget to look after yourself." One night after a long day at work, she came home to find a small envelope slipped under her door. It was from him. Inside was a photograph, the three of them at the community center opening, smiling naturally. At the bottom, he had written, "Some moments are worth more than everything else." She smiled, tracing her finger over the photo. It was simple, yet it made her feel close to him again. But then a few days later, something unexpected happened. She got a call from one of his employees, a woman who worked closely with him. The voice sounded worried. "There's been an accident," the woman said softly. "His flight was delayed because of a storm. The car that came to pick him up, it slid off the road on the way to the hotel. He's in the hospital." The words hit her like cold water. For a second, she couldn't speak. Her hands trembled as she asked, Is he all right?" "They say he's stable, just some injuries, but he's asking for you." Without a second thought, she packed a small bag and took the first flight she could get. The trip felt endless, every minute stretched by worry and fear. When she finally reached the hospital, it was late evening. The hallways were quiet, filled with that heavy smell of disinfectant and the low hum of machines. She found his room after asking the nurse. When she stepped inside, he was sitting upright, a bandage around his arm and a small cut on his forehead. The sight of him, alive, awake, made her chest ache with relief. When he saw her, his tired eyes softened. "You came." "Of course I did," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "You scared me," he gave a weak smile. "I'm sorry. Guess I wanted to know what it feels like to be rescued twice by the same person." She laughed through the tears that had been waiting to fall. "You don't need to make a habit of it." They sat together for a long time, holding hands in silence. Sometimes words weren't needed. Presence was enough. Over the next few days, she stayed by his side, helping him recover. She made sure he ate, walked with him down the hall, and reminded him to rest. He in turn kept saying how lucky he was, not because of his wealth or recovery, but because she had walked into his life that one day when everything was on fire. When they returned home, things felt even more fragile and precious. The near miss had changed him. He slowed down, fewer business trips, fewer meetings. He spent more time at the community center, more time with his son, more time with her. One afternoon, they were planting small trees in the garden behind the center. The kids ran around laughing, the sun warm on their faces. As she placed a seedling into the soil, he knelt beside her, watching quietly. "Do you ever think about how strange life is?" he asked softly. "How one moment, one decision can change everything?" She nodded, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think about it all the time." He smiled faintly. "When that car caught fire, I thought it was the worst day of my life. But now I see it differently. Maybe it was the day everything began to change for the better." She looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You mean the day you met me?" He laughed. "Exactly. The day I met the person who reminded me what really matters." The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh soil. For a long while they worked in silence, side by side, the air filled with quiet contentment. That evening, when they walked home, his son ran ahead of them, holding a small flower he had picked. "This is for you," the boy said, handing it to her. "Because you make my dad happy." Her heart melted. She smiled, taking the flower carefully. "Thank you. I'll keep it forever." As they reached her door, the boy ran inside to grab his toy car, leaving the two of them alone under the porch light. He looked at her, his voice low but steady. "You know, I used to think happiness was something you had to chase, something you had to build with effort and control. But now I realize it's something that happens when you stop running and just let it find you." She looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "You stopped running then?" He smiled. "Only because you made me want to stay still." The moment stretched between them, warm, quiet, and real. He didn't make promises, and she didn't ask for any. They didn't need to. What they shared wasn't built on expectation, but on something deeper: trust, respect, and the simple truth of being there for each other when it mattered most. In the months that followed, their lives intertwined naturally. She continued her work. He continued his, but they met in the middle. For coffee, for walks, for the little things that make up a life. His son adored her, and soon she became part of their small, beautiful world. There were no big declarations, no fairy tale endings. Just real moments, laughter in the kitchen, quiet evenings watching the sunset, shared glances that said more than words ever could. Sometimes, she would think back to that day, the fire, the chaos, the sound of a crying child. How she'd acted on instinct, not knowing it would lead her here, and she'd realize that life often works in quiet, mysterious ways. That kindness once given doesn't just end, and it grows, spreads, and sometimes returns when you least expect it. One evening, as they stood by the community garden, the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. He turned to her and said softly, "You changed my life." She smiled. "No, you changed your own life. I just happened to be there." He reached out, taking her hand. "Then I'm glad you were." The wind brushed past them gently, carrying laughter from the children playing nearby. The world felt calm, full of promise, not because everything was perfect, but because they had found peace in imperfection. And in that simple, ordinary moment, it was clear that what began as a rescue had turned into something far greater. A bond built not on circumstance, but on compassion. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't running into a fire to save someone's life. Sometimes it's opening your heart after the smoke clears and letting love quietly walk in.